We're here today in the rec hall at Red Arrow Camp to tell the story of Little Joe. Before we begin though, it's probably important to point out a couple of things. First, it may seem unusual to you that we're telling the story this year with so few people here in the rec hall. That's not unusual at all. The story of Little Joe is told countless times across this country and even in other countries every year by parents, grandparents, aunts and uncles as they tell their children the story of Little Joe. So the fact that there are only a few of us here today really isn't unusual at all. The second thing that we should point out is that the story of Little Joe isn't written down anywhere. It's been told at Red Arrow Camp for generations and passed down from year to year to year, just like it probably is in your family. I'm sure that there are relatives that you've never met that you know about, because those stories, that oral history, has been passed on down to you, so that you can in turn tell the stories to your children. So where to begin the story of Little Joe? For Red Arrow, the story of Little Joe began 100 years ago, in 1920, when Clarence Rasmussen bought Red Arrow Camp. But as the story unfolds today, you'll see that Little Joe's story actually began years before that. But we'll begin the story with Raz and the purchase of Red Arrow Camp. Raz knew nothing about Little Joe when he bought Red Arrow. But he did know that one of the important things he needed at Red Arrow Camp was a cook. And it just so happens Raz was across Trout Lake at what was then called Trout Lake Station. Trout Lake Station was a combination post office, dance hall. It was a place where a person could get a cool drink. And there, Raz met a man named Red Hauer. And as it turned out, Red Hauer had worked at the Courtney Wright Lumber Company, the buildings that Raz had purchased for Red Arrow Camp. Furthermore, Red was a cook. And so Raz hired Red Hauer, and by the way, Red's picture is right over here on the collage in the kitchen. Raz hired him. He was the first cook at Red Arrow Camp and continued to be the cook until his death in the 1950s. And it was Red who brought the story of Little Joe to Red Arrow Camp. Back in those days, and when I say those days, the late 1800s and the early 1900s, there was no television, there were no Wi-Fis, radio was barely emerging, and so an important part of the entertainment industry was the circus. And one of the best circuses in the United States, perhaps the best, was the Ringling Brothers Circus, located or stationed in Baraboo, Wisconsin. Baraboo, Wisconsin is about 20 or 30 miles north of Madison. The Ringling Brothers Circus Museum is still located in Baraboo, Wisconsin. And at that time, Mr. Ringling thought, and probably was correct, that he had the best circus in the world, and he wanted to keep it that way. So he was constantly seeking talent so that his circus was the very best. About that time, he heard about a performer in Europe. A performer who could do something that no one else could. This performer was a trapeze artist, and this performer, Mr. Ringling was told, could execute the triple somersault on the high trapeze. In other words, this performer could leap off of a bar and do 1, 2, 3 somersaults in the air and reach out and grab the next trapeze. Something no one else could do. Mr. Ringling wanted this person to be in his circus. So he went off to Europe to find him. Now, back in those days, he didn't hop on a plane. He had to take an ocean liner across the ocean, and yes, he did discover, he was able to locate this magnificent performer. And so he went to watch him. And one thing surprised him when he went to watch him. He was not a very big man, but he was a performer and a professional. And when Mr. Ringling first saw him perform, most circuses had 3 rings. Well, the other 2 rings shut down, and all eyes were focused on the center ring as this little man came out to the applause of the crowd, bowed to the crowd, waved to the crowd. He had a certain aura to him, and then he would climb up to the top of the circus tent to begin his routine. When I say the top of the circus tent, he performed at heights of up to 50, 60, 70 feet in the air. To give you some idea, our climbing wall here is 40 feet. So imagine someone performing 10, 20, 30 feet higher than that. It was dangerous. And yet, Little Joe and the other performers were professionals, and they took all precautions. Although Little Joe didn't take one precaution. He was so confident in his abilities, he never performed with a net, which made his performance all that more magnificent. And Mr. Ringling watched as he and his fellow performers went through several routines, and then finally the drums would roll and Little Joe would perform his triple somersault on the high trapeze. Mr. Ringling was convinced this was a person he wanted in his circus. And before he approached him, he was made aware of 2 other things about Little Joe that he didn't know about previously. Number 1, Little Joe was an orphan. Little Joe had been literally deposited in a basket as an infant in front of one of the circus wagons. So he grew up in the circus. It's not unusual that he became a performer. That he became an elite one was a little bit unusual. The other thing he realized about Little Joe that was even more important is that he was one of those very special people. He was a person that everyone wanted as a friend. He, in turn, was friends with everyone. He was one of those special people that just because he was there, he was present, everyone else did a better job. Sometimes you hear about athletes, for instance, a baseball player. Sometimes they used to call Paul Molitor the Igniter, who was a former Milwaukee Brewer. And in his position at third base, maybe he didn't make a single play, maybe he didn't get a hit, but just because he was in the game, the team did better. Little Joe was one of those people, which made Mr. Ringling even more convinced that he had to have this performer with his circus. So he approached Little Joe, offered him a lot of money, but Little Joe wasn't interested. He was that very special person. He was very happy where he was in his circus family in Europe. But then, remember, Little Joe was also an orphan, and one of the things that bothered Little Joe is he didn't know who his people were. He could remember very, very little from his infancy, but one thing he did remember was something that was probably a nursery rhyme that went something like this. Tak kurie, kuli buli minto, tokasti, tokasti lay. When he told Mr. Ringling about that, Mr. Ringling said, "You know, That sounds like the language of the Ojibwe Indians in northern Wisconsin. Now Little Joe was interested because he really did want to know who his people were. So he said yes. He told Mr. Ringling that he would come to the United States and be a part of the famous Ringling Brothers Circus. He was an instant hit. Crowds came from all over to see him perform. And time after time, Little Joe, the other two circles would close down, Little Joe would come out. He would bow to the crowds. He was very much a showman, bow right, bow left, wave to the crowds. Then he would climb to the top of the circus tent 50, 60, 70 feet in the air and go through his magnificent performance. Always culminating, the final part of the act each time is when Little Joe would launch himself out off the trapeze and do not one, not two, but 3 somersaults 70 feet in the air, and at the right moment reach out and grab that next trapeze to the thunderous applause of everyone watching. He was a great hit. After the circus season ended, Little Joe got on a plane and came up to northern Wisconsin to see if indeed the Native Americans in northern Wisconsin were his people. And although the languages seemed similar, they weren't the same. It was a disappointment for Little Joe because that's the reason he had come to the United States. As disappointed as he was, he fell in love. He fell in love with northern Wisconsin. Its beautiful lakes, its magnificent forests, its wonderful rivers, and he especially fell in love with a place in northern Wisconsin called the Courtney Wright Lumber Company, because that's where Mr. Ringling had arranged for Little Joe to stay when he came to northern Wisconsin to perhaps seek his people. Little Joe's life fell into a routine then. He would perform in the circus during the circus season, which began in the spring and went to the fall, and then he would come to this wonderful place, the Courtney Wright Lumber Company, on the shores of Trout Lake. In both places, he was that very special person. The Ringling Brothers Circus performed even better once Little Joe joined the troupe. And the lumberjacks in northern Wisconsin, these big, tough Scandinavian men working in the logging camps in northern Wisconsin, came to love and admire this little man who came to visit and stay with them every winter when they did the majority of their work. The circus happened in the summer, the logging operations happened in the winter. Little Joe was a magnificent success. And each summer, he would continue to perform his magnificent feats. All the other acts would stop. Instead of having 3 rings operating at the same time, all eyes were on the center ring when Little Joe came out, acknowledged the crowd, would climb to the top of the tent, check and make sure. He had always done this before the performance, but he would check and make sure that all the lines and all the ropes and all the trapezes were in good order, and he would astonish the crowd with his amazing ability on the high trapeze. Then the day came, a hot, sweltery summer day. Huge crowds had come. It was the first day of the circus in town. All the seats were packed, and Little Joe came out, acknowledged the crowd as he always did, waved, climbed to the very top of the circus tent, and began to go through his routine. A single somersault here, in exchange with another artist there. And finally, the triple somersault. And as the crowd reached that crescendo of anticipation on this particular time, no one is sure quite what happened. Did he not quite reach the trapeze? Was it so hot and sweltering that it was covered with sweat? Regardless, little Joe plummeted to the circus floor 70 feet beneath his trapeze. All the other performers rushed out. People were terrified. There were people crying in the stands. Little Joe was unconscious. He suffered many broken bones, but he survived. He survived, and gradually he got better. His bones healed, but one thing was never quite the same. He had sustained some head injuries also. And he was never quite the same person after that. He was still little Joe. He was that special person that everyone loved so well. He was that special person that made everyone around him perform better and feel better about themselves. He had performed so many years in the Ringling Brothers Circus and done such a credit to the circus that Mr. Ringling decided that little Joe could retire, that he could go to his special place in northern Wisconsin and enjoy not just the off-season of the circus with the lumberjacks, but also enjoy the beautiful summers in northern Wisconsin at the Courtney Wright Lumber Company on the shores of Trout Lake. And so the lumberjacks welcomed him with open arms, because although most of their work was done in the winter, they still had things to do in the summer, and little Joe was in heaven on earth, being able to live in the place he had fallen in love with. And he hadn't forgotten his career as a performer. No, there were no circus tents in northern Wisconsin, but there were magnificent pine trees. Magnificent pine trees on the grounds of the Courtney Wright Lumber Company. And so, very frequently, the lumberjacks would see little Joe walk out onto the quad of the Courtney Wright Lumber Company, hearing the applause and the adoration of people in the circus. His mind had gone back to his career in the circus, and he would bow to the imaginary people, and he would scale up the pine trees at the Courtney Wright Lumber Company, and he would swing from branch to branch in those magnificent pines, to the awe of the lumberjacks watching this man perform. And occasionally he would leap from one branch and do a somersault, or maybe two. And every once in a while, one or more of the lumberjacks was fortunate enough to see little Joe perform his triple somersault in the magnificent trees at the Courtney Wright Lumber Company. As fate would have it, one day when little Joe was performing to the imaginary crowds in the trees at the Courtney Wright Lumber Company, the inevitable happened. Did he miss the branch? Did a branch break? No one knows for sure. But again, he plummeted to the ground. This time, he wasn't so lucky. This time, little Joe was dead. The lumberjacks came out in tears, big, tough, rugged men, devastated by the loss of their friend. They took his crippled little body and they buried him beneath 3 of the pine trees that little Joe loved so well. Red Hauer shared this story with Raz, because by the time Raz bought Red Arrow Camp, little Joe had been gone for quite a while. But his spirit his spirit of friendship and camaraderie had remained at the Courtney Wright Lumber Company and now was at Red Arrow Camp. So the spirit and the story of Little Joe is central to what happens here at Red Arrow Camp every summer. The friendships and the relationships that are formed here are a part of his legacy. And so the story of Little Joe and his legacy for Red Arrow Camp is really the foundation upon which Raz was able to build a successful boys' camp on the shores of Trout Lake. Yes, Little Joe's been gone a long time, more than 100 years, but for Red Arrow, his story began 100 years ago when Red Arrow Camp was founded, and his spirit remains at Red Arrow today and will forever. So I hope you've enjoyed this story of Little Joe. Once again, it is perhaps the most important part of the history of Red Arrow Camp.